So today I'm going to kind of summarize a conversation with a young survivalist or prepper. I do a lot of volunteer work at the local animal shelter, and I was there fixing some locks. They had 3 locks that were sticking, so I took them apart, cleaned them, adjusted the striker plates and things like that. And there's people in their 20s that are coming into the prepper and survival movement. There seemed to be a big gap between 30-year-olds and 50-year-olds where there really wasn't that much interest in survivalism or prepping. That was more of kind of like a video game LARPing era where the people were more interested in entertainment than actual survival. And having a conversation with this young man, he kind of represents a group in his area. And in our area, most groups are family oriented, where it will be extended membership of families. And he's starting to get his fruit trees in order. And I talked to him about a lot of the experiences I had in the area and a lot of the things I learned the hard way. I started growing stuff probably when I was around 10 or 11 and working with my mom and dad in the garden area. And then I did a lot of stuff on my own as I got older. And I learned a lot of hard lessons. And I talked to him, and he reiterated that a lot of the plant material that they were buying locally does not seem to yield fruit. And we got into a discussion of some of the basics of agriculture that a lot of people disregard, and you rarely ever hear it mentioned on social media or even in professional circles or in ag classes. So we're going to kind of talk about that a little bit. Now, one rule of thumb is row crops take the most work for the least productivity. Then you have stuff that is vine material like grapes, blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, things like that. And then you have a lot of Asian fruits and vines that you can grow that are very productive. And you'll find that there's a lot of cultivars of different fruit that's not grown commercially because it won't withstand shipping and storage. But for our purposes, it produces a lot of variety, and it can input a lot of minerals and vitamins and nutrients into your diet that you wouldn't normally have. So fruit trees bear the most food for the least amount of effort, but most of the effort is up front. And when I was talking to him, the critical thing you have is you got to realize you work in a microclimate. So a lot of the climate data is general that you'll see on the USDA and Ag Department websites. So when you're looking at climate zones, that's very general information. And I told him, I said, in my 40s, I started recording actual temperature data for different locations on my farm. And what that did is yielded me actual real data on highs and lows, amount of rainfall, wind speeds. And for instance, this winter, we had a lot of wind and a lot of moisture. The wind did a tremendous amount of damage to fruit trees in this area. The other thing that happened is we had a sustained low of around 6 degrees that knocked and did damage to a lot of plant material that's marginal for our region. So over a period of time, you can grow some marginal crops and fruit trees, and what will happen is they won't yield every year, but they will yield most years. but you run the risk that they can be wiped out or severely damaged. So this is one of the years they were damaged because the 6-degree low sustained for a while. When you look at air drainage, air drains off of hills in orchards down into low areas. So the high areas are actually warmer at night. And what I noticed was the bottom half of some of the trees were burned because there was sufficient warm air layered above the cold that you only had limited damage instead of totally killing the trees. Then we talked about chilling hours. It's ultra critical that you get temperature data for your area so you know how many chilling hours you have on an average winter. And depending on what definition of chilling hours you use, 35 or 32 degrees, you have to reach that point for like 4 hours a night. And if you don't have sufficient chilling hours, your fruit trees won't set blooms, or they won't set blooms that are productive to make fruit. So when you're buying cultivars, you have got to know what chilling hours you have on your farm, because you can plant an entire farm and all of the US ag data will say it'll be productive, but you won't get any fruit. So you've got to record your chilling hours. So you should start doing that immediately. And what I did on my farm is I put weather stations up. So I have weather stations in the low area and I have weather stations in the upper areas, and that way I can tell the difference in temperature and how the air flows. And some days during the winter there'll be 10 degrees difference between the high areas and the bottoms. So if you have a fruit tree that needs a lot of chilling hours, maybe 1,000 chilling hours, you would plant them in the bottom so the cold air flows down to them. And if you're doing peach trees, you would plant them on the top and part way down your hills. That way the cold air flows off of them at night and it doesn't burn the blooms. Now, we discussed chill hours in depth, in that you can actually find the cultivars you need from ag department information to suit your area. So don't go to Lowe's and Home Depot and these other stores and buy your material for fruit trees, because you have a high probability that it doesn't have the proper chill hours, because they're buying that stuff on low bid basis. So if you really want to produce a lot of fruit, you need to order from the specialty producers and growers that are making seedlings and trees and things like that. And you want to go to the professional nursery trade to get your rootstocks. Now, the size of tree and your water table are critical. We discussed that he should go around and dig perk holes on his farm, and you dig it and 24 hours later you go back and you see whether there's any water in the hole and at what level the water rose to. Now I would suggest you go down 5 feet when you dig the perk hole, because what you're going to want to do is determine the water table level, and you're going to want to do this several times throughout the year because you'll have seasonal changes in your water table. And what that does in my area is, in the summer our water table is higher until we reach the 3 months of drought that we normally have in July, August, September. And on different areas and on different hillsides on my farm, the water table may be at 2 feet, maybe at 3, and it may be at 5 feet. And that determines the size of tree that you plant. When you plant fruit trees in our area, you have to water them for 2 to 3 years for them to become viable. Otherwise, they'll die, because with dwarf trees, they may penetrate 2 foot, 2.5 foot into the ground. So if they don't get down to the water table, you have to water them forever. and they're susceptible to drought. Semi-dwarf trees can penetrate down to 3.5 feet, depending on the cultivar and the rootstock. So in your perk holes, if you have water most of the year at 3 feet, it may take you 3 or 4 years of watering trees before the roots get to the water table and can water themselves. Now, full-size trees, which most people don't like to grow anymore, they're very productive in my area because we have areas where the water table's 5 or 6 foot in the ground, and that's the only cultivars or full-size trees that will actually get down to the water table and sustain themselves. So in a survival situation or in a long-term economic collapse, you may not have the time, people, and fuel to water plants. So you need to pick cultivars and dwarf, semi-dwarf, or full-size trees suited to your acreage in the specific locations on your acreage so that those trees will water themselves. Then we talk some about storage. So in our area, you can actually grow different varieties of fruit, and you can have fruit produced between 6 and 8 months out of the year. So if you pick them properly, you can have fresh material grown. If you have greenhouses, that makes it even stronger that you can go to 8 months of production. That way you store less. So when we're looking at maximizing our survival potential in SHTF or in an economic collapse, we want the most for the least effort, because you may be working on something else. You may have to work on something else. You may have to go somewhere to make an income, and you have minimal caretakers at the farm. So if things can feed themselves and water themselves on the plant side, that gives you a stronger option for survival. Now, the other thing that he wanted to talk about was nuclear war. And we talked about the economy and fixing things. And it's kind of interesting. If you go to Lead Farmer, you see the left-wing side of survival where you have Trump derangement syndrome, and you have a survival population that one of their main incomes was from government and the medical side of things. So they're being hit pretty hard by the downsizing. On the other side, you have integrative preparedness, which is more of a private sector style of mentality and thought. You can kind of take their perspectives, add them together, divide it by 2, and then you have reality, because both of them are wrong on a lot of things, but they will provide you useful information in your survival efforts. So what you do is you just watch their material, take what suits your efforts in your area, and discard the rest. Now, with NutnFancy, in his latest video about nuclear survival, he's kind of off the rails in a lot of ways. And talking to this young fellow, we talked about nuclear warfare, targeting, that kind of thing. And we talked about the probable megatonnage that would be delivered to the 5 large cities that surround us. And I pointed out we live in a 1 psi to 0 psi overpressure area based on targeting maps. And that's a good place to be versus the cities. So on the one hand, for nuclear survival, if you live in a city, you have to have a blast shelter. If you live outside the city and you're not near a target area, you can have a fallout shelter. And there's a huge difference between those. Now, 90% of the U.S. population lives within 100 miles of a coastline. So they're going to get wiped hard by a nuclear attack if it's a comprehensive attack. The thing is, most of them will not die instantaneously. They'll die of radiation poisoning over time or starvation, because most of the population won't die in the initial strike. They die from the aftermath of a nuclear war. So I'm going to disagree with NutnFancy and a lot of the other people, and you have to make a firm decision on if you're going to be in an area where you need a blast shelter or you need a fallout shelter. There's a huge difference in expense and the size. You can build a much larger fallout shelter than you can a blast shelter, and you can support a lot more people. So I put out a tremendous amount of information. I got over 650 videos, so you can go back and look at all kinds of stuff on nuclear war survival, how to make things. It talks about above ground blast shelters that very few consider but are great options. Talks about reinforcing your house, because at 1 to 2 psi overpressure you're going to have roof damage. So if you have a basement or a home-based shelter, it won't be weather tight. So if you take and you do those reinforcements to your house, it will remain weather tight and viable in a fallout environment if you have a house-based shelter. So he and I talked about a lot of things, and one of the last ones we talked about is cyclical destruction of plant life on farms. In my lifetime, I've seen over 60 years of ag failures, and it came at about 20-year intervals. So for instance, in 2014 in our area, we had a lot of weather between -7 and -9 degrees, and that even burnt a lot of the native plants. And when you're 10 or 15 degrees below the average winter weather for your area, it's very destructive over short periods of time to a lot of your fruit trees and vines. This winter we had a lot of high wind and we had a lot of rain, and we had 6 degrees sustained, so that destroyed some trees and didn't bother others. If the 6 degrees had been for an overnight or a day or two, it wouldn't have done the damage it did. Then, I guess 20 years ago, we had fire blight, and it had been 80 years since that was seen in our area, and that wiped out all of the pear trees and a lot of the apple trees in about 8 counties surrounding us. So from a agricultural survival standpoint, long term, you're going to have a variety of mixed fruit that and vine crops that will tolerate large amounts of variation in temperature, rainfall, and wind loadings. That way, if you have 8 or 10 major types of crops, you will get enough to eat in a bad year. In a good year, you'll have an overflowing abundance, but the critical thing is in the bad years, you have to have enough variety to survive. Most modern agriculture is based on monocropping, where they're growing one thing or they're growing 2 things. So this is part of the conversation I had with the younger guy, and one of the most interesting comments he had is, in his age group, a lot of people are not interested, but there's enough people that are interested to save most people. So I thought that was an interesting and different perspective. Please share your thoughts. We'll see you on the next video.